Hello everybody, hope you're doing marvellously well. We're Big, Bad and back with another Frequently Asked Questions Friday. So there's a lot of rather lovely questions I'm reading down here. But firstly, of course, if you haven't already, please subscribe. You can hit the like button. And of course, if you go to producelikeapro.com, you can sign up for the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. Okay, let's get stuck in some questions. Besides width, what can I do to make my mix stand out in a mixing contest? What grabs that attention and just makes the jury feel, oh boy, this is something? I have judged a couple of mixing competitions, actually a fair amount more than a couple. But I would say the best examples I can give are two different albums. I did an album with a band on Atlantic called The Dance Party. We did a mix-off for that. And then I also did the Fray's second album, and we did a mix-off on that. In both of those instances, there was a lot of really well-known mixers, especially on the Fray album, because their first album had sold 4 million copies by then. So, a lot of people wanted to mix it. I can tell you what things people did to try and get the mix. One of the most famous pop mixers around, probably the most famous pop mixer, and you can all guess who that is, he mixed the Fray song by almost completely and utterly limiting each section. And this obviously wouldn't have been what he would have sent to a mastering engineer, but to get it so that the band could be excited about it, what he did is he really hit his master bus pretty hard, so it was slamming and it was really super loud, but he turned it down about 1.5 dB in the verse. And then when the chorus came in, it went up another, right up to 0. So you basically had this like super loud pumping verse and then bang, it came up. So you had this effect. I'll do it from your position, which would be like this, stepped up, came down a little bit in the second verse, came up more in the second, down for the bridge and loud for the out. And it was like manipulated dynamics. What we did in that situation is we had the assistant level match all of the mixes so that they weren't perceptibly louder than the other. However, regardless, this trick does work. If you're in a mixing competition where people are going to download files and they're going to examine them, might find that a little cynical, but the reality is like it's one of the tricks that people do to get the gig. Other mixers on that, had a lot more width and a lot more depth and weren't as loud. And luckily what happens, because the assistant, volume matched it pretty accurately, they were all played back at a very similar level. And the reality is for the Fray second album, we chose Michael Brower. Michael seemed to have the most amount of width. It sounded super full, had a lot of depth, and it just generally felt far more in keeping with the song. It wasn't a million miles away from my rough. It was just like a better version of my rough, and it kept the spirit and the integrity of the song and the artist. So when you're asking about tricks to do things, it really depends. I get mixes of my songs inside of the Academy that we get to listen to all the time. And one of the things is I really, really enjoy, when people do things that take my ideas to a completely different place. So in a mix competition, it depends on what the criteria is. If it's purely just mixing the source and not doing anything like adding stuff, then I think you take their rough mix and you make more of it. So take that rough mix and find the things that jump out to you that needs to be better. In that instance, you might think, well, I need more depth, I need more width, I need it to be louder, the drums need to be more slamming. Take a bit of time and listen to their rough quite a few times, make some notes and write down how you think it could improve before you even start to mix. And then use that rough as something to go against and get better and better and better. If, however, or as well, they give you the opportunity to do remixes, that's where you can have some fun with it and add some additional instrumentation, make those choruses jump out of the speakers, really play with the dynamics, do a lot of muting, which again, you should be able to do muting in a regular mix competition, to be quite frank. Now, we talked about Andy Wallace mixing stuff and basically taking like 6 guitars in the choruses and bringing it down to a stereo heavy pair and then maybe an outro high line or something on the end of the chorus. Part of the beauty of what he would do is like cut through all of the BS and get something really simple and concussive and percussive. It just smashes you over the head and sounds fantastic. So I think that is a part of mixing anyway. If you have the opportunity to add stuff and make it bigger and wider and louder at times, then that will give you the edge as well. It's really a combination of making sure that it's just loud enough, just proud enough to just like jump out of the speakers, that you've got enough dynamics that you can really make those choruses pop, that you give yourself a lot of opportunity for the song to feel wide and have some depth. So don't over compress and over limit, because you know what might seem loud on a pair of earbuds because it's high mids and square waves won't necessarily translate when you go up against somebody who's got some 40 hertz nicely underneath on the kick drum, and it just feels huge, and they've got really super wide pan guitars, and yours is like this squashed mid-range screaming Hulk. So that's something you have to really think about, is just, once again, go back to that rough and find out what you would improve with the rough and build from there. That, I think, is the best template I've ever done. When I've done mix-offs, like I've done 3 albums now with Rick Springfield and a whole bunch of singles, and I've mentioned this before, so some of you can glaze over, but I got that gig in a mix-off against a whole bunch of other mixers. The way I got it is I listened to the track and I felt like everything was there. The vocal was incredible. The guitar playing was amazing. Rick Springfield and Tim Pierce were both incredible guitar players, and the drums, I could tell, were really well performed, but they weren't like slamming and loud enough to really compete with those guitars in the way that they should. So what I did basically is concentrate on making the drum sound absolutely massive. It just screamed at me, this is the big differentiator. And then when I came to mix the guitars, the guitar production that had been done by Rick and Tim was so well crafted by those two phenomenal players that it actually almost mixed itself on the guitars. There was only little tiny bits of EQ, some high and low passing here and there, but essentially in a bit of verbs and a bit of delays to just, you know, make them feel a little bit bigger. But it was subtle stuff. It was the drums that were screaming out at me. So once again, go back to the rough and just make notes. How can you make it better from the rough? And that will tell you so much, and you'll really improve your chances of winning a mix competition. Would love to hear your approach on singers that belt, but also sing quite softly for different parts on the same songs. For example, the verses could be very soft and the choruses could be all out belting. Do you sometimes separate the belting parts and the soft parts to different tracks so you can process them differently? Yes, I do. However, one of my tricks is I like having lyric sheets. I like having the ability to have a lyric sheet and have a pencil and mark off takes that I like. But more importantly, you know, maybe there's a first line, most of it's like take 1, there's a couple of words on take 2 that I love. If I don't get something, I can mark it off. Also, the other thing I can do is I can figure out my gain setting. So what do I mean by that? It's a nice trick that I love to do all the time. And if you've got an external mic pre, you would do it on the external mic pre. If you've got an internal mic pre built into your interface, you can do it directly on there. And what I will do is I will take my lyric sheet, I'll mark off the soft sections, and then when it gets to a belting part, I'll mark down the gain. So I can sit there and basically crank the gain in the verses, and then when it gets to the chorus, bring it down. And it brings this vocal forward the whole time. And there might be times where it's just like a phrase or a word or two that's super loud. So I've been known to sit there, especially with Neve-style clicking gain control, to have maybe 40 or 50 dB of gain in a really soft section, and then click it down 2 for a louder part, and then click back up, click down. The point is what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get that mic pre to be working at its finest at all times. And I love doing that because that gives you a much more even sounding, much better sounding, frankly, vocal, because the mic pre, especially if you have a nice one, is going to always be working right on the edge. And that's such a wonderful, wonderful sound. If you've got a classic old 1073, you've got a reissue of a 1073, you've got one of the clones of a 1073, it's the beauty of it, is that you can push it right on the edge, just click down 1, and even though you're not hearing any audible distortion, you're just right on the edge of just picking up some little tiny harmonics and stuff. So it's a really wonderful place to be in. So That's really my biggest tip. Now, of course, if the singer, because remember, you've got to be led by the singer. If the singer wants to sing full takes, then that's what you do. You learn how to gain and move between sections. But if they don't want to sing full takes, then all bets are off. Now it's so much easier. You can just concentrate on getting the right levels for the verse, and you can do multiple takes on the verse. What I'd probably do is do all the verses, 1 and 2, and then all of the choruses and whatever the bridge is, separately. And that way you can have multiple takes to comp. But lots of people like to sing it all the way down. And if they do, working with that gain control is the way to go. How do you tune a snare drum sample? I can think of two ways, EQ and pitch shift. What would you do? Well, I wouldn't think of EQ necessarily for tuning. I know what you're saying. You could obviously focus on the high end of a sample. If a sample in particular, you wanted to bring out more of like the bottom snare, you might go in there and take 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and start boosting that gently up, and maybe you'll hear a bit more snare rattle out of the sample. And what I've been known to do, and many of you sure have done as well, is like high pass and get rid of all the super lows and low mids and just put the mid range in there and just dial maybe a drum sample in just to get pss, pss, pss. Those are definitely aspects. But if you're talking about full-blown tones, yes, pitching it down is a huge thing. Because if you've got like a snare recording, a live drum kit, and the snare just isn't, it's got so much bleed in there, and no matter what tricks you're trying, you just can't get it to sound good, but you want a snare to match it, then yes. I've done things like take a snare sound, a hit, if it's got like a ring in it, and I've taken like an auto-tune plugin or Melodyne, set it to an instrument track, and then just read it and seen what the note can be. So let's just say it's tuned to an A below C, so it's like kind of a wong. What you could do then is you could take the snare sample that you've got, you guessed it, and then pitch it using Melodyne or Auto-Tune or whatever you have down to that note as well. So even if it's not exactly the same sample, if the ring is in there and you're fine with that little tone, then you can pitch them both to the same place. There's all kinds of things you can do. I mean, honestly, you can do it just manually. You can just put the snare in, lay a few hits, loop a couple of bars of your loop that sample, put it against a live snare, and then just adjust the pitch down until it starts to match. And then you can process it afterwards if you like. So every single snare sample is, completely processed and matched to the live snare. There's all kinds of things you can do. But going back to the EQ idea, yes, I understand what you're saying, but it's not so much a tone. Yeah, EQing would be there to enhance maybe low end or high end or mid range, but actual pitching I would do with some kind of pitch change. It could be a Serato, it could be Melodyne, it could be Auto-Tune, it could be Waves Tune. There's so many different things on the market. Your DAW probably has infinite amounts of possibilities. So this is actually a very important thing to do, because if you have to use, and you're being forced into using a snare sample, you don't want it to just sound completely alien with the rest of the mic. So I agree, tuning the snare sample to the actual snare is a really, really smart idea. That way, you haven't got overheads with a, crack, and your snare sample's going doing, wouldn't make any sense. Maybe a little blend of it for some energy, but if it's going to be the main part of your snare, very, very smart idea to tune it so it's pretty darn close, if not spot on, with all of the mics that are picking it up. Rooms, overheads, you name it. Imperfections are fine, I quite agree. Sometimes it's what really makes a part come to life. My question is, what's the quickest or easiest way to spot these mistakes that just won't pass? Example, we had a track done, working on getting the mix right, and we had probably listened to the song at least 50 times, when I suddenly heard a spot where one of the bass notes was totally out of time. It was an easy fix, but it amazed me how many times I'd listened to the song before I heard it. Any tips on how to spot these types of mistakes quicker? The answer to the question is in the question, because, what you said, you'd listen to it multiple times. So what tends to happen is when we're in the mix zone, especially if you're moving from tracking into mixing, you'll start listening to your mix elements as like, EQ moves and compression and stuff like that. And you stop hearing it quite so much as a whole. So I've had those things happen to me too, but it tends to happen because I'm getting too far too focused on individual things and I'm not hearing the whole song. If a bass note's really badly out and it's like kick, snare, kick, boom, I'll hear that when I'm just standing back and listening to the song, not going, oh, what's wrong with that guitar? I've got to, what EQ do I have to play for that guitar? Oh, the vocal needs this, When I'm obsessing about that stuff, I'm not hearing the song as a whole. So there's quick ways to do that aren't really quick because it's about time. It's about working quickly and then taking frequent breaks. So, and this is a whole bunch of different discussions, but one thing I will say, every major mixer I've ever sat in a room with works really, really quickly. Like really quickly. But they may spend a long time on the song because they might work on it for like 20 minutes and do like a whole bunch of moves and then take a break, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 minutes, and then come back and listen to it and do a whole bunch of other different stuff. Maybe they work for that for like 45 minutes, then take a break for a minute, give their ears a rest, come back, play it, listen to it. They could mix maybe, I remember Tom Lord Alge mixing my band's album. We were mixing 2 to 3 songs a day. Mixed the whole album about 4 or 5 days, with recalls. And the album sounded great. But he was moving quickly and making great decisions, and it just started to sound good so quickly. And then it just became like little subtle moves that we could do in recalls. The reality is like moving quickly allows you not to get focused on one thing for too long. And when I'm super focused on like the snare drum sound or something like that, I'm not hearing the song anymore. So probably what's happening, well not probably, definitely what's happening is you're listening to all of these different EQ moves and compression moves that you're doing and you're not hearing the song. And then maybe you just switch off all of that for a second thinking, hey, the song's pretty done. Oh, why is that bass out of time? It happens to us all, it happens to the best of us. So move quickly, decision-making wise. Try not to spend hours obsessing over one thing and give yourself enough frequent breaks so that you can come back and always hear it as a whole and not just each individual part. Well, it was a wonderful Frequently Asked Questions Friday. Thank you ever so much for all of the marvelous questions. Please leave a whole bunch of new ones below. It's really wonderful. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Don't forget to go to producelikeapro.com, sign up for the email list, get a whole bunch of free goodies. If you haven't liked yet, please hit the like button and subscribe and have a marvelous time recording and mixing.